In the mountains of Veracruz, Mexico, in 1609, a group of formerly enslaved Africans faced down the Spanish Empire and won their freedom. This is the story of how they did it, and the man who led them there. The year was 1545, somewhere in Central Africa. A boy was born into what many historians believe was royalty, possibly among the Bran people of what would become Gabon. His name would come to mean many things over his lifetime, but the one that stuck was Yanga. Some say it meant pride in the Yoruba language. Others claim he came from the Yangbara people. What we know for certain is that this man, like millions of others, would be ripped from his homeland and forced across an ocean into a system designed to break him. Unlike most, he would find a way to break that system instead. By the time Yanga was a young man, the transatlantic slave trade had already devastated West and Central Africa for decades. Portuguese traders had established networks along the African coast, capturing people or buying them from local intermediaries who profited from the chaos of warfare and kidnapping. The demand for enslaved labor in the Americas was insatiable. Spain had conquered vast territories and needed workers for the brutal industries that would make them rich. The indigenous populations were dying by the millions from European diseases and the violence of colonization. The Spanish needed replacement labor, and they turned to Africa. New Spain, as colonial Mexico was called, became one of the largest importers of enslaved Africans in the Americas. Between 1521 and 1594, approximately 36,500 African slaves arrived on Mexican shores. Then, from 1595 to 1622, 322 slave ships delivered over 50,000 enslaved people to Mexican ports. By 1646, there were nearly 168,000 enslaved black people in New Spain. Only Brazil imported more. These weren't abstract numbers on a ledger. These were human beings, each with a story, each with a life that was stolen from them. Yanga was one of them. Sometime in the mid-1500s, he was captured and transported across the Atlantic. The Middle Passage killed countless thousands through disease, starvation, and the sheer horror of being chained in the hold of a ship for weeks on end. Yanga survived. He was brought to New Spain and sold to work on a sugar plantation called Nuestra Señora de la Concepción near Veracruz. He was baptized with the Christian name Gaspar, as was the custom. Gaspar Yanga. The Spanish wanted to erase who he had been and remake him into a tool for their profit. Veracruz was the main port on Mexico's eastern coast, the entry point for both cargo and human beings. It was also where the sugar industry was concentrated, and sugar meant slavery. The work was back-breaking and deadly. Enslaved people worked 18-hour days cutting cane under the tropical sun, then processing it in mills where accidents could cost you an arm or your life. The heat, the exhaustion, the casual violence from overseers, it all added up to a system designed to extract every ounce of labor from a person's body, and then replace them when they broke down. But Yanga wasn't broken. If the stories about his royal lineage are true, and a Jesuit priest who met him later wrote that he would have been a king in his own land, then he carried something inside him that couldn't be taken away. A sense of who he was supposed to be, a refusal to accept that this was all his life would ever be. He wasn't alone in that feeling. Across New Spain, enslaved Africans were resisting in every way they could. Some worked slowly, sabotaging equipment or crops. Some ran away, hiding in cities or trying to blend into indigenous communities. And some organized rebellions. The Spanish were terrified of slave revolts. In 1537, an attempted uprising in Mexico City failed, but sent the shockwaves through the colonial government. Between 1560 and 1580, enslaved people who escaped from the mines of Zacatecas joined with indigenous people to raid haciendas and roads. In Pachuca, escaped slaves hid in an inaccessible cave and came out to steal cattle and supplies. The pattern was clear. Enslaved people would run, find defensible positions in difficult terrain, and build communities of runaways. The Spanish called these people cimarrones, or maroons, and the communities they built were called palanques. Around 1570, Yanga made his move. He was 25 years old, in his physical prime, and he'd had enough. Local lore says he killed 23 Spaniards who tried to stop him. Whether that number is exact or exaggerated, what's clear is that Yanga led a group of enslaved people off the plantation and into freedom. They fled to the highlands near Veracruz, to the mountains around Pico de Orizaba, the highest mountain in Mexico. The terrain was brutal, dense forest covering steep slopes, but that's exactly what made it defensible. The Spanish couldn't easily send armies into those mountains, and the people who knew the land could always stay one step ahead. Yanga and his followers built their palanque in isolation, hidden from Spanish authorities. They farmed corn, beans, squash, cotton, and sugar. They raised small herds of cattle. They created a functioning community with houses, eventually even a church. And they weren't alone for long. Other escaped slaves heard about the palanque and made their way there. By 1600, a man named Francisco de la Matosa arrived. Matosa was from Angola, captured as a young boy by Portuguese slavers and transported to Mexico. He'd escaped from his masters and brought his own group of followers to join Yanga's settlement. By 1609, the palanque had grown to more than 500 people, with the population split roughly equally between those working the land and those trained for defense. But they couldn't survive on farming alone. The palanque was too far from any market to trade their goods, and the Spanish weren't about to do business with escaped slaves anyway. So they turned to raiding. The Camino Real, the Royal Road, ran between Veracruz and Mexico City, carrying all the wealth flowing in and out of the colony. Silver from the mines, goods from Europe, luxury items for the wealthy colonists, it all traveled that road. Yanga's people would ambush caravans, take what they needed, and disappear back into the mountains. They also raided nearby haciendas, stealing supplies and sometimes freeing other enslaved people who would then join the palanque. This went on for nearly 40 years. Think about that. For almost 4 decades, Yanga maintained an independent community of free black people in the heart of Spanish colonial territory. They defended themselves, governed themselves, and lived outside the system that had been designed to own them. The Spanish knew they were there. They knew about the raids. But the terrain was too difficult, and the Maroons were too skilled at guerrilla warfare for colonial authorities to do anything about it. Until 1609, when the Viceroy of New Spain, Luis de Velasco, decided enough was enough. By 1609, rumors were spreading that the Maroons were planning something big. The Spanish heard that Yanga's people intended to attack colonial settlements, kill white settlers, and crown a black king. Whether these rumors had any truth to them or were just Spanish paranoia doesn't really matter. What mattered was that Velasco saw the palanque as a threat that needed to be eliminated. The raids on the Camino Real were hurting commerce. The very existence of a free black community was an insult to the entire system of slavery. If word got out that freedom was possible, that people could escape and actually survive, It might inspire more rebellions. The Palanque had to be destroyed. Velasco sent word to Pedro González de Herrera, a soldier based in Puebla, to assemble an army. In January 1609, González de Herrera set out with 550 men. Only about 100 were Spanish regulars, professional soldiers paid by the crown. The rest were conscripts, mercenaries, and adventurers of various backgrounds. As they marched toward Veracruz, they picked up another 150 indigenous archers and more irregulars. This was a serious military operation, not a police action. The Spanish were coming with overwhelming force. Yanga knew they were coming. The Maroons had their own intelligence network, and word of the Spanish expedition reached them well before González de Herrera arrived. Yanga was now 64 years old, too old to lead men into battle himself. He turned to Francisco de la Matosa, the Angolan who had joined the community 9 years earlier, and put him in charge of military operations. Yanga's own son, also named Nyanga, served as Matosa's lieutenant. They had about 500 fighters total. 100 had some type of firearm, probably old muskets and arquebuses they'd captured in raids. Thus, other 400 were armed with machetes, bows and arrows, stones, and wooden atlatls, the spear throwers they'd adopted from the local indigenous people. Before the battle, Yanga tried diplomacy. The Maroons had captured a Spanish prisoner during one of their raids, and Yanga sent him back to González de Herrera with an offer. Yanga asked for a treaty like the ones that had settled conflicts between indigenous peoples and the Spanish. He wanted recognition of the Palanque as a self-governing territory in return for tribute to the crown and promises to support Spain if the colony was attacked by a foreign power. Critically, Yanga also offered to stop accepting new runaway slaves. Anyone who escaped after the treaty was signed would be returned to their owners. It was a significant concession, meant to calm the fears of the many slave owners in the region. González de Herrera refused. The Spanish didn't negotiate with escaped slaves. That would be admitting that the system could be challenged, that enslaved people had some kind of legitimate claim to freedom. So they marched on the Palanque, and on February 23, 1609, at 8 in the morning, the battle began. A Jesuit priest named Juan Laurencio accompanied the Spanish forces, and he wrote a first-hand account of what happened. The Spanish divided their troops into two groups, the arquebusiers and the indigenous archers. They sent scouts ahead to look for ambushes. At one point, a dog the soldiers had brought with them started barking, and the scouts discovered 80 Maroon fighters hidden behind a stone wall, waiting to spring a trap. The Palanque itself was built on top of a hill, protected by the steep terrain, dense forest, and narrow approaches. The Maroons knew every inch of that ground. The Spanish were fighting uphill in unfamiliar territory against an enemy who had been preparing for this moment for years. The battle was brutal. Both sides took heavy casualties. The Spanish eventually managed to fight their way into the Palanque and burned it to the ground. But that wasn't a victory. Yanga and his people had already retreated deeper into the mountains, taking the women and children with them. According to Laurencio's account, the Palanque they'd burned had been occupied for only 9 months. It was a newer settlement, not the main community. The Spanish found about 70 houses, fields planted with crops, and the church, but they didn't find most of the people they were trying to capture. For days, the Spanish tried to hunt down the Maroons in the forest. It was hopeless. The terrain was too difficult, the forest too thick. The Maroons knew where to go, how to set ambushes, how to harass the Spanish troops with hit-and-run attacks and then disappear. The Spanish were suffering losses, running out of supplies and making no progress. González de Herrera raised a white flag and tried to negotiate. The Maroons rejected his offer. They withdrew further into the highlands and continued their raids. The stalemate lasted for years. The Spanish couldn't defeat the Maroons militarily, but the Maroons couldn't go home because their homes had been burned. Both sides were stuck. The raids on the Camino Real continued. Escaped slaves continued finding their way to Yanga's community. The colonial economy was still being disrupted, and the Spanish still couldn't do anything about it. Finally, in 1618, 9 years after the battle, the Spanish agreed to talk seriously about peace. Yanga's original terms from 1609 were put back on the table. Recognition of the Maroon settlement as a free, self-governing community. The right to their own land. An end to the raids in exchange for tribute and promises of military support if Spain needed it. And the agreement to return any slaves who escaped after the treaty was signed. The Spanish added 2 conditions. First, only Franciscan priests would be allowed to minister to the community. The Franciscans were seen as the religious order most aligned with protecting indigenous and African people from abuse. Second, Yanga and his descendants would be granted the right to govern the town in perpetuity. This was extraordinary. The Spanish were essentially creating a hereditary black dynasty in the Americas. The treaty was signed in 1618. By 1630, the town of San Lorenzo de los Negros de Cerralvo was officially established. Later, it would also be called San Lorenzo de Cerralvo, or just San Lorenzo de los Negros. The town was located in the mountains southwest of Veracruz, in what is today still the state of Veracruz. For the first time in the Americas, there was a legally recognized free black settlement. One not through the benevolence of colonial authorities, but through decades of armed resistance and negotiation from a position of strength. We don't know exactly when Yanga died. Some sources say 1609, the year of the battle, but that seems unlikely given that the treaty negotiations extended until 1618. He was probably in his 70s by the time the treaty was signed. What we know is that he lived long enough to see his people gain their freedom and his family granted the right to govern. That was something almost no one else managed in 3 centuries of slavery in the Americas. For a long time, Yanga's story was largely forgotten. The settlement continued, but the broader world moved on. Mexico won independence from Spain in 1821. Slavery was abolished. The particular achievement of San Lorenzo de los Negros got lost in the larger narrative of Mexican independence. But in the 1860s, a Mexican historian named Vicente Riva Palacio was digging through the archives of the Spanish Inquisition, and he found documents about Yanga and the 1609 expedition against him. Riva Palacio was a remarkable figure himself. He was a novelist, short story writer, military general, and mayor of Mexico City. He was also the grandson of Vicente Guerrero, Mexico's second president, and a man of mixed Spanish, indigenous, and African ancestry who had abolished slavery in 1829. Riva Palacio published an account of Yanga's story in an anthology in 1870, then as a separate pamphlet in 1873. His work brought Yanga back into Mexican national consciousness. In 1871, 50 years after Mexican independence, Yanga was officially designated as a national hero of Mexico and given the title El Primer Libertador de las Americas, the first liberator of the Americas. That title is significant. It's saying that before the Haitian Revolution, before Mexico's independence, before any of the independence movements that swept through Latin America in the 19th century, there was Yanga, forcing an empire to recognize the freedom of formerly enslaved people. In 1932, the town of San Lorenzo de los Negros was officially renamed Yanga in his honor. Today, the town has about 20,000 residents, mostly people of mixed heritage. Every August 10th, they hold the Carnival of Negritude, celebrating Yanga's successful revolution and the African roots of Mexican culture. There's a statue of Yanga in Veracruz, showing a muscular figure raising a machete in his right hand with a broken shackle still attached to his left wrist. The inscription calls him a liberator and precursor of freedom for enslaved black people. But Yanga's legacy is complicated, and it's worth being honest about that. The treaty he signed in 1618 included a promise to return escaped slaves to their owners. From one perspective, that's a betrayal, an agreement to participate in the same system that had enslaved him. But from another perspective, it was the price of survival. Yanga had to choose between the people he'd already freed and the people who might escape in the future. He chose to protect the community he'd built, even if it meant making a deal that left others in bondage. That's not heroic in the simple way we sometimes want our heroes to be. It's the kind of impossible choice that people in impossible situations have to make. And it's important to remember that Yanga didn't act alone. Francisco de la Matosa, the Angolan who led the military defense in 1609, was crucial to the community's survival. There's a town in Veracruz named Matosa in his honor. The hundreds of other Maroons who fought, who farmed, who built houses and raised children in those mountains, they were all part of this. Yanga was the leader, the one who organized it all and negotiated the treaty, but he couldn't have done it without everyone else. The broader context matters too. New Spain was full of Maroon communities. Some were successful for a time, others were crushed. Yanga's palanque was remarkable, not because it was the only one, but because it was the one that managed to win legal recognition. That's partly because Yanga was strategic, willing to make compromises and negotiate, rather than just fighting to the death. It's partly because the Spanish colonial government realized that the cost of destroying the palanque was higher than the cost of just letting it exist. And it's partly luck, the right combination of circumstances that allowed this particular community to survive when so many others didn't. What's clear is that Yanga understood something fundamental about power. He knew that freedom wasn't something that would be given to him. He had to take it and then defend it. For 40 years, from 1570 to 1609, he maintained an independent community through a combination of military defense, economic self-sufficiency through farming and raiding, and strategic positioning in terrain that was almost impossible for colonial forces to control. Then, when the Spanish finally came with enough force to threaten the palanque's survival, he fought them to a stalemate and forced them to negotiate. That's not the story of a benevolent government granting freedom. That's the story of people winning freedom through their own efforts and refusing to give it up. The African diaspora in Mexico is often overlooked. When we think about the history of slavery in the Americas, we tend to focus on the United States, the Caribbean, and Brazil. But New Spain had the second largest enslaved African population in the Americas after Brazil. By the 17th century, the free black population in Mexico actually outnumbered the enslaved population, despite slavery still being widespread. African people and their descendants were everywhere in colonial Mexico, working in mines, on plantations and ranches, in cities as artisans and laborers. They intermarried with indigenous people and with Spaniards, creating the complex racial categories that defined colonial society. They left their mark on Mexican culture, in food, in music, in language. Today, there are still communities in Mexico with significant African ancestry, mostly concentrated in Veracruz, Guerrero, and Oaxaca. For a long time, these communities were invisible in Mexico's national narrative, which focused on the country's Spanish and indigenous heritage while ignoring the African contribution. That's starting to change. In 2015, Mexico officially recognized Afro-Mexicans in its national census for the first time. Cultural institutions are beginning to acknowledge the African presence in Mexican history. And Yanga's story is part of that recognition. The statue in Veracruz, the town that bears his name, the annual carnival. These are ways of saying that African people weren't just victims in the story of the Americas. They were also resistors, fighters, people who refused to accept the roles that colonialism assigned to them. Yanga's community in the mountains was one example of that resistance. There were many others throughout the Americas. The Quilombos of Brazil, the Maroon communities of Jamaica, the independent settlements in Suriname, all over the hemisphere. Enslaved people were running, fighting, and building lives outside the system of slavery. What makes Yanga's story particularly significant is the legal recognition. Most Maroon communities existed in a state of permanent warfare with colonial authorities. They might last for decades, but they were always vulnerable to military campaigns designed to destroy them. Yanga managed to change that dynamic. He forced the Spanish to acknowledge that his community had a right to exist, a right to self-governance, a right to their own land. That treaty in 1618 was a crack in the foundation of colonial power. It was an admission that the system wasn't absolute, that it could be negotiated with, that formerly enslaved people could become political actors with legitimate claims. The historian Vicente Riva Palacio understood this. When he wrote about Yanga in the 1870s, Mexico was still grappling with questions about its national identity and the legacy of colonialism. Riva Palacio, as the grandson of Vicente Guerrero, had personal reasons to care about this history. His grandfather had been of mixed African, indigenous, and Spanish descent, and had been executed by his political enemies in 1831. By highlighting Yanga's story, Riva Palacio was making an argument about what Mexico was and what it should be. A nation built on resistance to oppression, a nation that acknowledged all the different peoples who had contributed to its creation. That argument is still relevant. Mexico, like much of Latin America, has a complicated relationship with its African heritage. The ideology of mestizaje, the mixing of Spanish and indigenous peoples, has often been used to erase or minimize the African presence. Afro-Mexicans have faced discrimination, being assumed to be illegal immigrants from other Latin American countries, even though their families have been in Mexico for centuries. The phrase, "working like blacks to live like whites," is still used in Mexico, revealing attitudes about race and labor that have their roots in the colonial period. But there's also a growing recognition that this history matters, that the African contribution to Mexican culture and Mexican history needs to be acknowledged and celebrated. The Museo de las Culturas Afromestizas in Guerrero and the museum in the town of Yanga are preserving and presenting this history. Scholars are doing more research on African slavery and resistance in New Spain, and Yanga's story is becoming more widely known, not just as a historical curiosity, but as a founding narrative of Mexican freedom. Because that's what Yanga represents. He represents the idea that freedom is something worth fighting for, something worth organizing for, something worth negotiating for over decades if that's what it takes. He represents the idea that systems of oppression aren't inevitable or permanent, that they can be resisted and sometimes defeated. And he represents the complexity of resistance, the difficult choices people have to make when fighting for survival in a world designed to crush them. The Treaty of 1618 wasn't a perfect victory. Yanga's community remained relatively isolated. They paid tribute to the Spanish crown, and they agreed to return escaped slaves. But within those constraints, they built something real. San Lorenzo de los Negros survived as a free black settlement through the rest of the colonial period and into Mexican independence. The town exists today. That continuity from 1618 to the present is remarkable. Most maroon communities were eventually destroyed or absorbed into colonial society. Yanga's community became an officially recognized part of that society while maintaining its identity and independence. In 2019, the Mexican composer Gabriela Ortiz wrote a piece called Yanga, using text by Santiago Martin Bermudez. The music reflects on Yanga's story and the African cultural roots found in Mexico. In 2023, the United States National Endowment for the Arts awarded a grant to develop a drama about Yanga's life. His story continues to inspire, continues to be retold, continues to matter. When we talk about the history of slavery and resistance in the Americas, we need to include stories like Yanga's, not just the stories of famous abolitionists and politicians, but the stories of people who took matters into their own hands, who didn't wait for the system to change but forced it to change. Yanga and the people of San Lorenzo de los Negros did that. They created the first legally recognized free black settlement in the Americas, and they did it through their own courage, their own strategic thinking, their own refusal to accept that slavery was their permanent condition. The mountains of Veracruz, where Yanga built his palanque, are still there. The town that bears his name is still there. And the principle that animated his resistance, that freedom is worth fighting for, and that oppressed people have the right and the power to claim it, that principle is still relevant wherever people are struggling for justice and dignity. Gaspar Yanga was a man who was supposed to be property, supposed to spend his life making other people rich, supposed to die in bondage. Instead, he became a king in a new land. Not the land he was born in, but the land he helped create through his resistance. That's a legacy worth remembering, worth celebrating, and worth learning from.